Okay, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you for joining us, wherever you are joining us from around the world. And yeah, welcome to the 21st installment of our monthly post-2020 webinars. This is the second one for the year 2020, and it is so fitting that we are now post-2020, literally, but the work still continues, and our team and our partners are still pedal to the metal, busy working hard, ensuring that we have a future that includes nature as we rebuild post this very challenging time that we find ourselves in. So as I said, this is the 21st installment of our monthly post-2020 webinars, and yeah, it's a space where we come to reflect on events and days gone by with regards to biodiversity and nature, particularly around cities, and also where we discuss what the plans are going forward. And last year, the years before that, it was all leading up and all roads leading towards COP15 in China, but obviously that was not possible to happen. But I think, as we always do in our space, is that we find new ways of working and figuring things out. So there's definitely still a lot of work to be done in terms of realizing a future with nature in our cities beyond 2020. So today's webinar is focused around rebalancing and looking at rebalancing our economy with nature. And we have an exciting all-woman lineup of speakers today, so very exciting. So just to mention and give a big word of thanks to not just ICLEI, but as always to our partners, and just to first and foremost say that this webinar is made available by the post-2020 Biodiversity Framework EU support. So always a big thank you to the EU support for the continued support and making these webinars available. And as always, we always like to give thanks, obviously, to the Global Task Force of Local and Regional Governments. And really, we can't do this work alone as ICLEI. And with that, we obviously rely and partner with a lot of like-minded organizations like of Regions 4, C40, UCLG, and the likes. So just a big thank you again to all of our partners. And as I mentioned, a very big thank you as well to the post-2020 Biodiversity Framework EU support. So just again, this is our 21st installment of these monthly webinars. And yeah, I think, and we will all agree that they've been well received over the last couple of years. And we at ICLEI and our partners feel very strongly on continuing this very important advocacy role towards the realization of this global biodiversity framework. And really, I think in the time that we are now, it is so fitting. You know, we are in the period now where the pandemic is definitely not behind us, but there's definitely now, it's definitely the time now to really start thinking and putting into action, you know, what the world looks like post-COVID. And I think, and particularly with our partners, we believe that nature is definitely at the center of that. And I think, you know, this time of the year, the beginning of the year, it's always a big time for biodiversity. I mean, we've celebrated World Wetlands Day on the 2nd of February last month. Yesterday was World Wildlife Day. And we all know how important it is not only to celebrate these very important days, but how important it actually is to keep them on the agenda and to keep talking about it and raising awareness and advocating for the importance of nature and wildlife and all the rest of it for human for all of our well-being. So very important. So yeah, like I mentioned, this is the 21st installment, the second one for the year. the 4th of March today. So this is our first of 2 sessions for the day. So there will be an afternoon session at 3 o'clock SAST time for those who are not able to join us for this morning session. And then the next one is scheduled for the 1st of April. So also just a reminder that all these webinars are recorded, and if you are interested in listening to the recordings of previous webinars, you are more than welcome to follow the link on the screen that you see right now. This is our agenda for the day, and as I mentioned, we have an all-woman panel, something that we're very proud of at ICLEI. So we're going to do some reflections, and then obviously, as I mentioned, just relook at the roadmap towards COP15 and just some of the events that's still in the pipeline and what the plans are moving forward. So before we do get stuck in, just want to share a couple of house rules. So just as I mentioned earlier, this webinar is being recorded. So by participating, you're automatically giving consent to being recorded. So that won't be a problem. The recording will be made available, and it will also be uploaded to all of our various platforms, YouTube especially. So if you do want to catch up retrospectively, you can obviously find the link to this webinar and the previous ones on our various platforms. You will see, those of you that are familiar with Zoom, there's a Q&A and a chat function on the taskbar at the bottom of your screen. We do encourage you to engage and ask questions using the Q&A facility. So if you do have any questions to pose to any of our speakers, please do feel free. If you want to spark conversation, introduce yourself, or just share any information or resources, please do make use of the chat. We do encourage you to be as interactive as possible. And then just to mention that we will have a Q&A session towards the end of the webinar, where we'll see, if time permitting, if we can field some of the questions from the Q&A or verbal questions to any of our speakers. So just some introduction. So I'm Ryan Fisher. I'll be hosting the session today. I'm a professional officer at ICLEI Africa in our Biodiversity and Urban Systems work streams. And then I'm also joined by Ms. Ingrid Kutsia, who's the Director for Biodiversity, Nature and Health, as well as in our ICLEI Biodiversity Center at ICLEI Africa. Then we have our Regional Director, Scobie Brandt, who wears a whole host of hats at the moment. So she's the Deputy Secretary General for ICLEI Global. She's the Global Director for ICLEI Cities Biodiversity Center, and then, of course, the Regional Director for ICLEI Africa. So very busy, wears a whole lot of hats. So again, Scobie, we want to say thank you for availing yourself today to join us for this webinar. And then someone perhaps a bit more new to the space, or to the series at least, is Mr. Kara Mahadio, who's a professional officer at ICLEI Africa as well in our Biodiversity and Nature-Based Solutions workstream. So thank you, ladies, for joining us, and we look forward to the insights that you will be sharing with us. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our first speaker, Ms. Ingrid Kutsia, who's going to just give us an update on the roadmap to COP15, and then also just share some useful information for us going forward. So Ingrid, thank you, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Ryan. And while you take me to the next slide, let me just say a few words of introduction. I see there's quite a few new faces or names in our audience today. So I thought it would be good to maybe just step back and give a bit of context for those that are not regular attendees. ICLEI Cities Biodiversity Center arranges these webinars on a monthly basis. And it's part of our advocacy work in the global nature and biodiversity space. And the idea is to provide information and updates on global events and also sometimes some of the regional events around biodiversity. So at the moment, obviously, as Ryan has said, the focus is very much on the big COP, Biodiversity COP, hopefully towards the end of this year as we negotiate a new framework or new deal for nature. But we are not limited to this. In fact, ICLEI has been advocating for the voice of local and subnational governments for more than a decade, related not just to the Biodiversity COP, but also other multilateral agreements such as the Ramsar Convention, etc. And we serve as the focal point in the global task force, specifically for the Rio Conventions, and then, as I said, specifically for the Biodiversity Conventions. And one of the things that we've been doing over the past more than a decade is to be holding what we call global biodiversity summits for local and subnational governments. And these are very important events because they are held as official parallel events to the biodiversity COPs. And the first of these is more than a decade ago. So we have a long and proud history of representing and advocating that local and subnational governments get recognition and are able to participate actively in the discussions, but also their contributions, very important contributions to implementation and achievement of goals and targets. So what I want to do now is just very briefly locate everybody sort of in terms of time. This is the year. Last year was meant to be the super year for biodiversity. This year is hopefully going to be the year where there will be a negotiation around the new deal of nature. The final dates are still uncertain, but the idea is that it'll certainly be towards the end of the year, more or less in line with the climate COP as well. And will be taking place. The host country and this year is China, and the host city is Kunming in Yunnan province. And in all probability, because of the pandemic, it will be what we call a sort of a blended event. So it will have some virtual as well as some in-person elements to it. But building up to this year, there are going to be, as you can see on those dots, there are going to be numerous events. There are a series of technical or the SAPSTA meetings taking place. We've just had some recently. There's going to be the subsidiary body on implementation meetings also coming up next week, and further meetings in the year of both of those two bodies, as well as the formal open-ended working group, which is where a lot of the negotiations do take place. There's a third one coming up. Again, as I said, the final dates are not 100% sure yet. And then, of course, very importantly, ICLEI World Congress, and we certainly are going to be focusing again on nature. That's going to be, the first part of that is going to take place in April, the first half of April, as a virtual event. And then there's the IUCN World Congress as well. And this year, of course, is the start of the decade on ecosystem restoration. So there's a lot of major events planned there. And we're very proud to announce that ICLEI is recognized as one of very few, I think there's probably about 15, not even maybe, global partners to the United Nations Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. So watch this space. We are planning some very, very interesting things. And if you can take me to the next slide, please. What I should also just say is that ICLEI in the previous COP, COP 14 in Sharm el-Sheikh, committed together with its other partners, Regions 4, the European Committee of the Regions, and the group on leading subnational governments, agreed to take up the challenge and the request from this CBD Secretariat that as many stakeholders as possible should participate. So we've created this whole roadmap of events and information sharing opportunities. We've set up a website together with our partners, also participated and really played a big role in the Edinburgh process, which was hosted and organized by the Government of Scotland, to make sure that the voice and the ambitions and the messages from cities and local authorities and subnational governments are heard and are communicated to the Secretariat and the parties, and that those can be taken up in the various documents and decisions and policy statements and things that come out through the negotiations. So just quickly, there were informal sessions, as I said, of the scientific subsidiary body on science technology advice to the CBD. This took place in February. It was virtual, and it was focused on parties, major groups, and of course representing local governments and subnational governments. That is where ICLEI falls in, as well as observers. And the idea of these informal sessions, both of the SABSTA and the implementation body, the SPI, is that they prepare for the big SABSTA 24 and SPI 3 meetings, which will still be held later this year, and to maintain momentum towards the COP. So the other important thing to understand is that these are not formal negotiations. There are no decisions made, but there are important statements that are made there, and they get taken up as towards the negotiations. So ICLEI and our network partners were at these informal sessions, and there was a joint statement that we made and submitted on behalf of local and subnational governments. And this dealt specifically with the scientific and technical information that will support the review of the targets and the goals, indicators and baselines. It was read on behalf of one of our partners, and it has been uploaded both on the CBD website as well as on the Nature Advocacy website, and you find the link. And just to let everybody know, we will post all of these links in the chat box. Next slide, please. So I think then what's coming up now, which is very important, is the informal session of the SPI. And again, we will be attending. It's coming up next week. At the moment, we're working on joint statements again, specifically on resource mobilization, which is obviously one of the topics that we're going to be talking about today. And there are all the references of the various documents. Capacity building, we're also going to be making a statement on, as well as mechanisms for reporting, assessment, and the review of the implementation of the new framework, and then also on biodiversity, mainstreaming, and other strategic actions to enhance implementation of the new framework. Now, as we have done in the past, as soon as these statements are made and submitted, we will also post them on our website. And if you take me to the next slide, I just want to quickly give some really important information and news. One of the things that has happened in the very recent past is that there has been, although there's been no formal notification yet from the CBD, and we understand that it is imminent. I've been trying to get hold of what the release date is, but so far we haven't heard. We know that they are working on it, they're busy translating, but this relates specifically to the engagement with subnational governments and cities and other local authorities to enhance the implementation of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. It's something that was submitted by the government of Scotland, forthcoming from the whole Edinburgh process, which those of you that have participated in these workshops in the past will be aware of. And it's really important because it is a document that sets out what are the ambitions and what are the things that our local and subnational governments are asking for. And it also includes the Edinburgh Declaration and the responses of the consultation on the plan of action. And the plan of action that I'm talking about refers to the plan of action that was adopted in 2010 at one of the CBD COPs, where for the first time there was a dedicated decision on the role of local and subnational governments, and it included a plan of action. And of course, ICLEI, together with its partners, through the Edinburgh process, but through all kinds of other processes and engagements with the CBD and CBD parties, we've been calling for a more ambitious new decision, because the current decision comes to an end, in fact, last year when the current biodiversity strategy also ended. So we have to get a new decision and a new framework or plan of action up. So this is really a lot of important information that's finally we beginning to see the light of day, and it is something that is then linked to the agenda for discussions in next week. And we are certainly hoping that there will be support from a lot of the parties. And if you can take me to the next slide, please. And just very quickly, a few other things that are important. The CBD has recently made available some documents for review, and there are 3 of them that are relevant to a lesser or greater degree to our constituency. The one, again, comes to the topic of scientific and technical information around goals and targets. And clearly, you know, we all know, working in cities and subnational governments, that this is where a lot of the local action takes place and where a lot of impact can be made. Particularly if you look at sort of collective local action, it can have a great impact and contribution towards meeting global targets. So it's important that cities' ambitions are also recognized and addressed in these various policy documents. There's also, and this is a new one, a gender plan of action. There was a previous gender plan of action, but they're now coming with an outline for a revised new gender plan of action, aligned to the updated zero draft of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. So that's also important. And then the one that was announced yesterday is a draft global action plan for biodiversity and health. And this is really important. There was, those of you that have been in our previous webinars, you would have heard us report back on a briefing session about exactly this topic, which is obviously very pertinent given the pandemic situation that we're in. And so this is a really important piece of work that we will certainly be looking at. And particularly also, we did mention in our last webinar, but I just want to mention it again, that ICLEI, you know, is very responsive to the situation, current situation, insofar as it affects our constituency and our community. And we are in the process of establishing a global city centre for One Health, very much along the lines of the City Biodiversity Centre, because it is so important and because health and biodiversity and climate are so interlinked. So that's also, I think, an important piece of news, and we will keep you updated on that. And then I just have a bit of other news, something that's also happened since the beginning of this year, and it's already been a very busy year. If you can take me to my next slide, please, Ryan. There was the United Nations National Environmental Assembly has also had to be an online, and they're also doing it in different parts. This happened during February. There was a intervention and an engagement with the major groups and stakeholders where ICLEI is represented and is representing the local and subnational government constituency. And one of the things that has come out of the UNEA first 5.1, they call it the online session in February, was to endorse the medium-term strategy for the next period going forward and its associated program of work, as well as some of the high-level messages. And I think what is important for our audience today is just to recognize that UNEP has committed to addressing the 3 big crises, environmental crises, which they identify as climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. And then one of the things that is really interesting to note is that in the medium-term strategy, there's a lot of emphasis on nature, animal and human health, biodiversity loss, ecosystem restoration, and it also recognizes the role of multilateral governance and a lot of more robust references to how local and subnational governments can participate and what the view is on that. And then just the next slide, please. The other news is from some of our partners, the Global Youth Biodiversity Network, which those of you that participated in our February workshop will remember they participated in that. They have some interesting advocacy training for young people, young leaders. So if anybody here is tuned in and is interested in wanting to know more about this, please pop us a chat. We will put you in touch with them. They do really great work and ICLEI works well together with them. That takes place in the middle of March. They're also having intergenerational dialogues during Earth Hour, which is at the end of the month. And then at the Nature of Cities Festival that has just taken place towards the end of February, ICLEI featured very prominently, and we did a lot of sessions, participated in sessions, also hosted several sessions on biodiversity. There was one particularly interesting one on biodiversity and finance, which relates to our topic today. And there was also a plenary dialogue that we moderated towards the end of the festival, which looked specifically at urban biodiversity and what are the things that the new framework should address in relation to cities. And then I think that's basically it for now, and I will see you then again later. Thank you, Ryan.
Thanks very much, Ingrid, for that update. I think it just shows there's a lot happening in the space, but again, just emphasizes the importance of ICLEI and our partners in ensuring that the voices of local and subnational governments are obviously not lost within these processes and obviously taken into consideration. And I think your last slide, Ingrid, also just on the involvement of the youth, I think that, that just goes without saying, is that the importance of involving the youth, of youth involvement in these processes going forward. So I think that's quite key. So thank you again, Ingrid, for that. We're going to switch focus now slightly, talk a little bit finance. And I'm going to call up my colleague Nakara Mahadi to make some sense of perspective. So yeah, just give us a sense of the bigger picture, and then yeah, just give us some insights into the recently published Dasgupta report. So Nakara, over to you.
Thanks, Ryan. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone that's joining us today. Thank you for joining us. And yeah, as Ryan mentioned, I'm here just to give you a brief perspective of biodiversity finance. I better put a disclaimer, I'm by no means an economist or an expert in this field, but I'm here to just share a little bit of what I do understand in this field of work. So to the next slide, please, Ryan. So I think maybe just to set the scene, I think it's good to really understand what biodiversity finance is and why is it so important. So according to the Biodiversity Finance Initiative, or better known as BioFin, biodiversity finance is the practice of raising and managing capital and using financial incentives to support the sustainable management of biodiversity. So essentially, in simple terms, this is the money that we need in order to protect nature and in order to prevent biodiversity loss. And these sources of finances can come from both private sector or public sector. The private sector includes money or finances from business or corporates, and predominantly the public sector is dominated by government budgets, whether it be national or at the local level. But why is biodiversity finance so important? Well, we all know that biodiversity loss is a big problem and a massive challenge for us. But essentially, it underpins our global economy, and it's been recognized by both the IPBES and the World Economic Forum that biodiversity loss is one of the greatest risks to humanity and to our global economy. And I think in terms of the COVID-19 pandemic, it's become more apparent of how important nature is to us and that it is central to our economic recovery. And I think pertaining to what Ingrid had said, I think looking forward, we've got to make this new deal for nature, and we've got to look at our recovery from the pandemic. So biodiversity finance is a critical component of that. Next slide, please. So the term biodiversity finance and the work that's been done in this sector isn't something new. It's been going on for a number of decades, and I would say that the first recognized global evaluations of nature or nature's assets was done in the mid-1990s. But I think we're all familiar that in about 2010, the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity, or better known as TEEB, as you can see on the left-hand side of the screen, was released. And this really started the thinking or the momentum around understanding the economics of our ecosystems and biodiversity and the value of nature to us, and trying to put an economic value to this. And obviously this has been met with criticism along the way, but it has evolved and developed. And we fast forward over the next decade, and there have been a number of reports and handbooks and guidelines that you can see, a few of which you can see in the middle of the screen, that have been published over the years. But the most recent, and the one that we're focusing on today, is the Dasgupta review, which was undertaken by the UK Government Treasury by Sir Partha Gupta. So onto the next slide, I just want to share some of those key messages that have come out of this review. And the first being that our economies, livelihoods, and well-being depend on nature. Essentially, just like how we have produced capital, which is our roads, buildings, and infrastructure, and how we have human capital, which is our health, knowledge, and skills, nature is also capital to us, and not only in the value that it provides us and what it gives us, but it also has intrinsic value in the sense that it has cultural value and value that we cannot actually put an economic value to, essentially. And the second is that we have failed to engage sustainably with nature. So where we're at the moment is that our current demand far exceeds nature's ability to actually supply us with the goods and services which we need and which we rely on. Yes, we've managed through the help with nature to prosper over the last couple of years, and we've been able to gain in terms of our produced capital and in terms of our human capital, but it has come at the expense of nature. And we need to act now rather than later because of this. And these failures are essentially rooted in not only the problem of not looking after nature, but it comes down to institutional failure. So nature hasn't been reflected in market values, and therefore it has been underinvested in over this time that we've built up our economy across the globe. Governments have also increased the problem by paying people to exploit nature. And this has become, so it's perverse subsidies, it's perverse incentives to actually damage nature and bring us to this point and essentially creating this challenge that we face with right now. It's based on the review, it says there's a conservative estimate of a total cost globally of subsidies that damage nature. It's around $4 to $6 trillion per year. So that's a large number in comparison, which I will show you a bit later, to what we're actually putting towards biodiversity and supporting biodiversity loss. And it far outweighs that amount. And we need to transform the way that we are doing things. And by doing that, we need to recognize that our economies are deeply embedded in nature, and that we need to account for our impact on nature to be able to rebalance this demand that we've put on nature so that we can find a way of striking a balance in ensuring that demand and supply is, well, at least demand is not outstripping supply, should I say. It's based on thinking of how deeply embedded our economies are in nature. It is estimated that our global GDP is dependent on nature and its services to the value of approximately $44 trillion. So that's, if we think about global GDP, and again, just bear these figures in mind when I come to some graphs a bit later about what we actually putting towards biodiversity conservation and protecting nature and stopping biodiversity loss. This far exceeds what we're actually doing. But there are ways that we can go about making changes. And we need to change how we think, act, and measure success. And there's three sort of broad areas of transition that we can make. The first being that we must ensure that demands do not exceed supply, and that we need to also change the measure of economic success. GDP doesn't necessarily account for the value of nature, and we need to look at more inclusive measures of wealth and economic prosperity. And an example of this is natural capital accounting, which I'll speak to a little bit later on again. And the third is that we need to transform our institutions and systems. And in particular, it's our financial and education systems, because these are critical and underpin us being able to move or support a more sustainable engagement with nature and being able to actually affect change. Thank you. On to the next slide, Ryan. So based on some of the figures that I've mentioned before, if we look at these graphs, the one on the left-hand side is showing that the current global financial flows into biodiversity in terms of conservation and being able to protect nature is between 124 and 143 billion US dollars. So in comparison, I think maybe just the scale of things, I was mentioning figures of what we're investing in terms of damaging nature, and those were in the trillions, whereas this is only in the billions. And I think that just puts it into perspective of that we're not investing enough in nature at the moment. But I think what's really scary and what's quite frightening is that based on some assessments that have been done, it's estimated that between now and 2030, we're going to need between 722 to 967 billion US dollars in order to prevent biodiversity loss and protect nature. So there's a massive gap in terms of the financial needs and resources that we actually are looking for or needing to protect nature going forward. And we need to look at ways of how can we close this gap and look at ways of how we can fund and resource biodiversity protection. On to the next slide. And I think maybe just to put it into context for cities and local governments, based on what is needed to protect or manage our urban environments, it's estimated that we need about 73 billion US dollars per year to protect nature that exists within our cities. So this is excluding nature and biodiversity that's on the peripheries of our cities. And I think with growing urban expansion, this need becomes ever more critical, because as we start, cities start spreading and we start encroaching into natural areas, this need to create or protect nature within cities particularly is really important. But I think there's another angle and there's another aspect to this, and that cities are also considered the engines of economic growth around the world, and they generate approximately 85% of our global GDP. So the potential and opportunity that cities have to generate the financial flows that we need for nature or to protect nature is critical, and it's so important. And I think looking at cities' abilities to transition to carbon neutral economies, there is need for financing to be able to do this. So again, just an emphasis that I think in this space, cities have two roles, not only to protect or manage the urban environments and the nature that exists within cities, but also in the sense that we need to use cities to generate the financial flows that we need to protect nature within city environments and beyond that. On to the next slide. So financial flows have grown over the years, and there are various instruments that are being used. And this is ever growing, but the BioFin team have created a catalog of financial solutions that have been used and in some places considered successful. It's not a cut and paste for all solutions in different places. Obviously, things have to be tailor-made and adapted accordingly, depending on what the situation is. But from their catalog, they've identified 68 public and private solutions. And there's a diversity of solutions, and they've classified them as different types. And these are debt and equity, fiscal, grants, market, regulatory, or risk management types of financial solutions. And these can be used in combination or separately, depending on what the circumstances are. And some of the examples that they've given under these different types could be biodiversity offsets, conservation easements, payment for ecosystem services. And many of these, some of us might have heard of, but I think it's really about how we use them and where we use them that actually makes them effective. So to the next slide, please. So talking about natural capital accounting, I mentioned it a little bit earlier. This is another tool that could be used in order to understand the value of nature and to look at where funding is needed. And it's a way that countries or regions can take stock of their natural resources and services within given ecosystems or within a certain region. And it provides this link between the economy and the environment. So if you look at that diagram, it looks at what are the stocks? So what are the natural assets or the natural capital that a certain region may have? What are the flows? So what do we gain out of those stocks? And what is the real value of that to society? And there are a number of frameworks for natural capital accounting. Yes, it's also been wrought with criticism over the years, and there's different stages of developments for the different frameworks. But I think it's not something that should deter or put off governments or businesses from supporting or embracing natural capital accounting. It's a way for us to actually start embedding the value of nature in our economy. And it would definitely make it easier in terms of our national economic accounts to start embedding the value of nature in our economy so that we start actually channeling funds to places where it's needed in order to protect nature. On to the next slide. So lastly, I just want to talk about some of the mechanisms or strategies that we can also look at to unlock financing or biodiversity financing. And this has been outlined by Biofin again, and it also, again, it depends on what the circumstances or what the nature of governments is. But there's 4 sort of major groups that we can look at and that we should consider initially when thinking about biodiversity finance. And that is firstly, looking at how we can generate revenues. This is looking at those financial solutions that I spoke about a little bit earlier. And those are all mechanisms of how we can leverage or actually generate more revenue for biodiversity. The second is then to realign current expenditures. So looking at what are we spending our money on or our budgets on right now? And how are we spending that in terms of biodiversity? And how can we look at realigning those budgets towards protecting nature and away from the harmful or damaging aspects or damaging activities that are detrimental to biodiversity? The third is to avoid the need for future expenditures. So looking at where we can reduce our expenditures and behaviors in terms of creating, again, more damage to nature, and looking at how are we more effective with what we have. And lastly, is the delivery of biodiversity management effort more effectively. So looking at how can we be more effective with what we've got? What are the strategies and what are the synergies that we can find to actually be more effective? And I think one of the ways that we can start doing this is by building the business case for investing in biodiversity. And the flowchart that you see at the bottom of the screen just alludes to the way that we can start building the case, because the problem that we have is that we don't have evidence, or not that we don't have evidence, there's not enough evidence, or there's not enough proof to show what the value of nature is to our economy and to society. And the way what we need to do is really build a sound business case. And these things take time, but I think if we consider a well-presented and well-structured business case where scenarios have been successful, this could be a positive way of generating biodiversity finances for the protection of nature. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Nakara. That's just, great insights. I mean, if I didn't know any better, I would say that you were a biodiversity finance expert. Only kidding. But yeah, I mean, some really good insights there. And I mean, yeah, you mentioned, all of the this relevant related studies that has been done over the decades. And yeah, as you mentioned, we're just simply not doing enough in terms of investing in nature. But I think on a more positive note, as you mentioned, there's real opportunity within cities and regions to change that dynamic and perspective. So I think we're definitely in the right spot then to facilitate that change together with our partners, of course. So great insights. Thank you for that, Ricardo. I see there's been some engagements in the chat and the Q&A, which is great. And as I mentioned before, we'll obviously try and get to all of the questions and to any queries and questions that are within the chats or within the Q&A as well. So moving along, we're going to hear from Ingrid again around, I guess, what does the resource mobilization mean at the local and subnational level? I think this ties in quite nicely with the previous presentation. So Ingrid, thanks for that, and over to you.
Thanks, Ryan, and you can take us straight into the next slide. So my stuff is going to be quite dry. I must apologize. And I'm not going to speak to every single word, but I just wanted to tell everybody that there has been a panel of experts that looked specifically at resource mobilization. And those are the three topics. It was looking, sort of a status quo assessment, and then looking at the estimation of costs and benefits. And a lot of the information that Nakara has given you has come out of some of those studies. But then importantly, also looking at how resource mobilization can fit into the new framework. And I think that a lot of what we're seeing coming out, and I'm going to just quickly refer to some of these things. The really encouraging thing is that they have heard the messages and the ambitions from local and subnational governments. And it's also something that was picked up very specifically through the Edinburgh process. If you go to the next slide, I think some of the key messages that I just want to emphasize on is that it requires transformative, inclusive, and equitable change. And they're very clear about dealing with it at all levels of government. And if you read the Dasgupta review, this whole thing about a shift in the type of economy and our whole mindset and paradigm, it's very central. And there are obviously a lot of specific things. They've got three clear strategic, interconnected and complementary components, which look at reducing and redirecting resources that cause harm, generating additional resources, and the issue of effectiveness and efficiency. To the next slide. And actually, this last one is quite important because if you talk about effectiveness and efficiency, it's at the local level where you can really optimize that. So that is important. And as I said, the whole of government and the recognition of a lot of the things that they're coming out of, the fact that you need to get cities and subnationals in there is important. Interestingly, also the emphasis on ecological infrastructure or green infrastructure, or whatever you want to call it, in how that can help achieve SDGs, UNFCCC, Sendai framework. So that's coming to this more transformational type of thinking. And then this point that Nakara was making towards the end is the idea of encouraging the uptake of ecosystem accounts. And I think the philosophy behind that is if you want to value and know what you've got, you really need to sort of count your natural assets, be they rivers or wetlands or whatever, integrate it into your budget planning, into your socioeconomic planning, and you need to value those assets. They are there for free, but that doesn't mean to say that they are without value. We need to treat them the same as any other asset we have. Next slide. So these just quickly are the three components that are being recommended. The one about reducing and redirecting harmful biodiversity practices. Again, they're talking about doing this at all levels of government budgets, not just at the national level, and about taking out harmful subsidies and scaling up disincentives that are harmful. Next one, please, Ryan. The one about generating additional revenue from all sources. This is about how to use existing government expenditure in a way that you can expand the envelope by, if you, for example, in your water and sanitation budgets or in your disaster risk budgets, if you factor in the natural assets and the natural benefits, your green infrastructure, etc. So those are the sorts of things that are also coming into the picture. And then just again, creating opportunities for investment in nature. And then finally, just the third component that we are talking about here is effectiveness and efficiency. I have talked about that briefly, and the whole thing there is the vertical horizontal coordination and about partnerships. And I think that those of you that do work in cities will understand the value of partnerships. Thanks, Ryan.
Thanks, Ingrid, for that very quick snapshot, very important as well. So we are running slightly out of time. But yeah, I think the conversation and the insights have been rich. So if we do run a little bit over time, we do apologize, but you are, of course, more than welcome to stay on. And as I mentioned at the beginning, the webinar is being recorded. So we will make the link to this webinar available to you afterwards. So our last speaker for the day, Kobe, thank you for joining us. And we're looking forward to you sharing some of your reflections on the importance of rebalancing our economy with nature. So Kobe, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ryan, and thank you very much to our team in the ICLEI Cities Biodiversity Centre for putting together this webinar. I think we're only scratching the surface here when we talk about finance and nature, and a lot of issues were touched upon, and we would very much like to encourage you to reach to us if you want to delve with us deeper into it. Nakara is a renowned and very respected scientist in the environmental and biodiversity space, but she's fast, as you can see, also learning to become a finance expert and understand the language of the finance world. And this is what many of us have to do in the biodiversity and nature and altogether the environmental space. We need to talk the language of financiers. We need to understand what our colleagues in the insurance industry, in the banks, in the ODA world, what they would consider as bankable and investable projects, because our cities know what they need to do. Our cities fundamentally are at the coalface of service delivery, and they can do it with nature or without nature. They can build 1 Paris a week with new infrastructure, because that's what's happening in the world today. They can use old methodology or hard infrastructure, or they can think out of the box and think about blue-green infrastructure, think about biophilic solutions, think about new ways of doing things in harmony with nature. But for those things to be funded and investable and for them to be able to sell that to investors and their own national governments, they need very strong business cases and the arguments. And therefore, they need to talk the language of these constituencies. And that's why we in ICLEI and across those of us that support cities and subnational governments, we are skilling ourselves up very rapidly to be able to talk to and bring these sectors closer to those of our constituency of local and subnational governments. So these dialogues and unlikely partnerships are absolutely key to get the momentum and the scale of change that is needed today to get that to actually materialize right here on the ground in our cities and towns. And I think it's you know, I don't know if all those people who have access to financing realize how much the economies, the local economies and even the national economies of countries really depend on nature. If we take, for an example, you know, about 1/3 of the world's 105 largest cities, including Los Angeles, New York, Rome, and Tokyo, depend directly on protected forests for a significant share of their drinking water. So, I mean, it may not be that apparent, but it's there, it's inherent. These ecosystems that underpin our livelihoods, our economies, in our cities, in our towns, and our city-region in interactions That is fundamental. And we see that these ecosystems are degrading, and some are very close to reaching tipping points or points of no return, where we will not be able to restore them to create the same type of value for us. So it's very important to value nature for what it is. It's still very important to keep on making the argument with political leaders, but also with captains of industry, with civil society, and a whole of society and whole of government networks to understand really what the value of nature is. Yesterday, we celebrated a world without nature on World Wildlife Day, and a number of us, including WWF and many of our partners, ICLEI as well, we just deleted the nature elements from our logos. And I would encourage you, go to Twitter and go and have some fun and explore how we did it. It's very, very hard hitting. But the reality is that if we take nature away, if we try and imagine a world without nature, it's as good as you imagine a world without people, because people will not exist in a world without nature. Yet, nature is not being regarded as something that is likely to be invested in. And if we look at the local level, we've heard about all the international instruments and so on from NACARA. We need to unpack it more. But let's just quickly, for a minute, look at what a city can already do. Cities can already, and many are, evaluating in many ways with hard evaluations and soft evaluations, evaluate what they get out of nature. And this pandemic, COVID-19, which we are still living through, has shown us how we feel when we are deprived of accessing nature. We have never, as a human race, been so deprived of being in nature, being with nature, engaging with nature on a daily basis. For our health and our well-being, our cultural practices, our spiritual and mental state of mind, our creativity, our energy, and our just our human beings, being a full human person, we have seen that we really need nature. We depend on nature, and we almost want to say that in a rights-based approach, don't people have a right to nature in their lives, even if they live in the very heart of a city center, in the CBD of the largest city? We are talking about a 15-minute city. I mean, Paris is talking about a 15-minute city in terms of being able to get mobile and connect across the city, but also connecting with nature. And that is almost, I would say, a fundamental right that is standing up like never before. And Ryan, I see that our time is up, but let me just end by saying that we have a golden opportunity here now to make a stronger argument than ever before that no city, and therefore also no country, will flourish and come out of the pandemic stronger and better if it's not with nature and in harmony with nature. And let's end with the thought of the UN Secretary General when Antonio Guterres, when he addressed us in December last year on the state of the planet. He was saying we are waging war against nature, humanity. But because humanity has gotten us to where we are in terms of this broken relationship with nature, it is also us, humans, that can fix this and set us on a new path. And we see many cities and regions absolutely committed to doing that. Many have joined platforms like Cities with Nature, where they learn and share and inspire each other and commit publicly, and then report on their commitments in terms of what they are doing with nature and for nature. Not only for nature, but for the well-being of humanity and the very survival of humanity. So I strongly would say that let's talk about what could come next as a measure of a well-lived life and quality of life. It's no longer GDP. GDP is no longer the instrument that we can measure our happiness, our well-being, and our quality of life now and for future generations. And then a very, very last point, just to say that we need to integrate agendas. The agenda around health, biodiversity, nature, food, nutrition, quality of life, social equity, inclusion, and of course, climate change. These are not separate agendas, and these cannot be addressed in isolation from one another. And that is why we also, like UNEP, are saying loudly and clearly, and our cities at the forefront are practicing loudly and clearly, integrated solutions, integrated approaches. And this is what we need to do when we tackle this new decade of ecosystem restoration and the decade of action on attainment of the Sustainable Development Goals. Thank you very much for the opportunity, Ryan, and thank you very much for everybody who have joined us today.
Thank you so much, Kobe, and sorry for rushing you at the end, but I think, yeah, powerful insights and powerful closing. So we always leave the best for last. We are running slightly out of time, and I don't see any live questions in the Q&A, but as always, if you do want to ask any questions, you're happy to shoot them or by email, and we'll be happy to answer them retrospectively. And as always, just as a continued call to action, I mean, Kobe mentioned Cities with Nature. This is the recognized platform by the SCBD for cities and regions, to join and really to sort of re-energize, if you like, the dynamic of nature in cities. So we are very proud of our flagship Cities with Nature platform. So please do encourage your cities to join. Please yourself do join. There's obviously various elements to Cities with Nature, not only for cities, but for academia, for private sector, and the general person on the street really to get involved. So please do check out Cities with Nature by following that link and to get in touch. And as always, if you want to learn more about what was discussed today, and ICLEI and our partners work around biodiversity, nature and cities more broadly, please do get in touch. We look forward to hearing from you, to partnering with you, and also to learn from your work, and obviously see how we can collaborate going forward. So thank you again for joining us. Thank you to our lovely speakers for availing themselves. And yeah, we'll see you at the next one on the 1st of April. But also remember that there's an afternoon session, a repeat of this webinar at 3 o'clock ST as well. So with that, thank you everyone. Keep well and goodbye.